It is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Mary Purdy holds a master's degree from Bastyr University, where she is currently adjunct faculty. She has given over 100 nutrition workshops. She speaks regularly at health and nutrition conferences and was the keynote speaker at Bastyr University's commencement ceremony in 2019. She serves on the board of Hunger and Environmental Nutrition and was chair of Dietitians in Integrative and Functional Medicine. Additionally, she hosts the podcast, Mary's Nutrition Show, and is the author of the book, Serving the Broccoli Gods. Her professional and personal goal is to help preserve our environment, one meal at a time. Today, Mary will be speaking on food systems and climate change, the role of integrative health practitioners. Please join me in welcoming Mary Purdy.
Thank you so much. I want to give a shout out to the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine and to Bastyr Center for Natural Health for making this possible for me to give this webinar, and to all of those who are out there attending during this crazy time, just acknowledging that this is quite an event that we are all living through. And thank you for joining me for this conversation today. Let's start off with just a couple of disclosures. As was mentioned, these are the areas that I have been working in and some of the affiliations that I have. So let's get started with some of the big picture pieces here, which was about 2 years ago. We were warned by the United Nations that if we didn't reduce our carbon emissions by about 40% by the year 2030, we would be in for a world of climate chaos and disaster. You can see all of these various headlines here. And we knew that the last 4 years have actually been the hottest on record. Our sea levels are rising, we've got coral reefs dying. As many of you may have experienced, there have been floods, there have been droughts, there have been fires. And we know that this is also having a big impact on our pollution, on creating heat waves, and a huge risk to food security. And we also know that it's pretty darn clear that the influence of humans has been well established. However, I want to give us some hope to start off with, because this is truly a time of change. And according to our Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, this is the time for us to be able to work together to save the planet, to achieve sustainable, inclusive human development. So you may be familiar already with the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. We will not be getting to all of those today, but there are a few that I wanted to highlight here. And ultimately, when we think about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, one of the main key components is about human well-being, which depends on reducing social inequity as well as protecting the environment. And we know, as integrative, holistic practitioners who see things from a holistic point of view, that these three items simply cannot be separate. They are all contingent upon one another and very, very intersectional. So we have an incredible opportunity. As folks who work in this integrative field, we understand and value that incredible connection between the mind, between the body, the spirit, and our environment. We also very often have a great appreciation for nature and the environment, and we often include nature as one of the potential interventions to address some of the health issues that we see. I don't know about you, but I have often talked to my patients about getting outdoors for a walk to help with their hypertension or their stress. We also focus on prevention, which is really, really critical right now, especially during this crisis time. And we look at the whole person. So trying to understand all the very many different facets that help someone to be healthy or unhealthy. And the same goes for our environment. So we have such an amazing opportunity. And really, I feel like we all have an obligation to begin to educate ourselves, our patients, our community, our institutions where we work on the issues of climate change. And because I'm a dietitian, I'm putting my main focus on our food system, because obviously there's numerous other factors that contribute to our current climate crisis. But I'll be focusing mostly on the food system and some of the strategies that we might be able to put into play, and maybe some things that we're already doing. So when we think about human health, We know as practitioners working in integrative and functional medicine as well, that we're looking to seek out the root causes of disease and the root causes of what is creating that imbalance beyond just genetics, right? So when we think of that healthy human, it's not just one thing. It's nutrition, but it's also sleep and stress. It's what our culture tells us and how that informs us. It's our environment. It's perhaps supplements and botanicals that we choose to take in. It's body work, it's spirituality, nature, it's physical activity. And then of course, it is also what is our access to all of these things that I just mentioned. So we are looking to redesign healthcare. As integrative practitioners, we want to see a shift in the healthcare process that's more inclusive, more integrative. Well, the same thing goes for our food system, which is why we as practitioners in the integrative space can really make a difference here, because we understand systems thinking. So our industrial agriculture, that has had a huge, huge impact on our climate and on our food system in general. So when we think of what a healthy food system is, the same way that when we think of what a healthy person is, there's so much that goes into it. It's never one thing in isolation. So it's about how we're using our land. It's about our food waste. It's about plant-based diets. It's about soil health. It's about the type of farming and agricultural practices that we have in play, regenerative practices, organic. It's about issues with our livestock. It's about chemical inputs, and it's also about animal welfare. So again, the same way that we are looking to redesign our healthcare system, we are looking to redesign our agricultural system to benefit us as humans, but also as a planet. And we think of these concepts in a larger term called agroecology. You may have seen this article. I really appreciated it as a way to understand how the practices that we are all engaged in, or that we may be engaged in the future, are actually a fantastic way to support both patient health and human health, but also it is a great prescription for our planet. And we are ultimately, as healthcare providers, an incredible force in educating our public about climate change and the impact that has on health issues. You've probably already seen this. But additionally, we as practitioners are one of the most trusted sources of information. So we can use that to our advantage. If our patients are seeking out counsel, seeking out wisdom, we can provide them with tools and thoughts and prescriptions that may ultimately help their health, but also help the environment at the same time. Right now, many of you may not know that our current healthcare system, in addition to being very, very broken in terms of serving the needs of the people, it also contributes to about 9% of our overall greenhouse gases. When I say GHG, and if you see that on the screen, GHG are greenhouse gases. So we have a really wonderful ability to provide people with all kinds of tools that actually have less environmental impact. Number one, we are working to prevent disease. So as practitioners who are helping people to avoid disease, that is ultimately putting less of a burden on our healthcare system, which will contribute less to climate change. Additionally, we are putting forth information and advocating for healthy whole foods that support health, that ultimately will support the planet. And I'll talk more about that, obviously. We're working towards looking to ways how we can reduce people's stress. So many different modalities that address this huge issue, which can have a larger impact on the global society and the planet. And we also look to food and spirituality as modalities, as well as modalities that all connect us to ourselves, to our culture, to each other, to our community, and to nature. So nature is an integral part of the way that we practice medicine and practice whole health living. We also know that the impact of climate change right now, the same way that the impact of our healthcare is disproportionate. It negatively affects communities of color, lower income communities, indigenous populations, developing countries, folks who have more vulnerable issues, elderly people, children. And when people are poor, it also reduces their ability to be resilient. So if climate change does come into someone's area, whether that's through drought or fires, when people are poor, they are less able to bounce back, and their vulnerability is much, much greater. So our goal, or the goal of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, says that if we can limit our global warming to 1.5 degrees, this is going to have really, really positive benefits, not only to people, but to our ecosystems. And ultimately, by virtue of doing that, will ensure a more just and sustainable and equitable society. So once again, we cannot separate out all these pieces. Environmental health equals food justice, equals climate justice, equals racial justice. You also may have already seen the impact of climate change on health. Health of folks who are in developing countries can sometimes manifest in very, very serious issues like malaria and dengue fever, cholera, malnutrition, diarrheal disease. But we are also seeing it here in the United States. Even just the quality of our air is having an impact on respiratory issues, on allergies, on asthma, on cardiovascular disease. And obviously there's all kinds of heat-related issues which are having an impact on people's ability to survive through major droughts and heat waves. So we are already seeing this as being a really, really big issue when it comes to our own healthcare system. And in addition to some of the chronic issues that we're seeing and acute healthcare issues we're seeing, there are also the mental health effects. There is something actually been termed eco-anxiety. So many people who have already struggled through climate change disasters are dealing with issues around their mental health. There's more suicide, there's greater anxiety and depression, huge amounts of stress, grief, anger, PTSD, having been through it. And now living through the age of Corona, we are also seeing more and more anxiety around what it means to be faced with this kind of a crisis. So we can't assume that patients aren't going to be coming to us with these exact concerns around what is the status of their position in this very, very uncertain time as it relates to climate change and how that might affect their lives and their health. So I want us as practitioners and as future practitioners to think about how incredibly empowering it is for us to be able to share with them information that may enable them to feel like they have a voice, that they have an ability to participate in a way that may be of benefit both to them, but also to that greater picture of environmental health. So let's talk about our food system, because our food system, if you aren't already aware, is a bit of a disaster right now. And it is contributing to about 1/4, and some would say even higher, of our current greenhouse gases. And this is due to the incredibly unsustainable practices, both in farming and agriculture and livestock production. It's also, when we think of that bigger picture, and the food system really is how we are producing our food, how we're transporting it, how we're distributing it, how we are processing it, how we are consuming it, and how we are wasting it. That is the nature of the food system. It's very comprehensive. And the way that we're producing food right now is completely unsustainable and quite degrading to our current environment. So we're seeing a huge loss of biodiversity because of all the monocropping. We use a tremendous amount of our fresh water. 80% of our consumptive water is going to agriculture and food production. There's deforestation. The way that we are treating our land is having a big impact on the quality of both our food, but also the land itself. 50% of land use is going again for food production. We're using a lot of energy, and we'll talk more about that. There's just an overall interference with the way that our cycles operate naturally, nitrogen cycles, phosphorus cycles. And then because of the issues that we have with food system problems, we have a huge amount of chemical pollution. And that's, again, from contamination, that's from the CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, as well as the pesticides and all the chemical inputs that go into food production. And then there's our food consumption. Sometimes we might feel like, I don't know what to do about the food production piece. I can't control a huge system like that. But there is also about what we consume or what we don't consume. There's also where we are purchasing our food, who we support, the food itself. What is the carbon footprint of the food that we and our clients, our patients, our communities are eating? What is the packaging like? How far away is that food coming from? And then, of course, there is what we waste. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But ultimately, there is an enormous food print that each and every one of us has, that our communities have, that our institutions have, that our academic places that where we work or train have. And all of those can be shifted to make a big difference in ultimately improving the planet, the health of the planet. The soil as well is having a big shift. It's much less healthy than it was. It's been degraded because of the way that our food practices, our agricultural practices are being put forth. Fewer nutrients in the soil. And in fact, about a half of the topsoil, that is that rich soil that should be providing us with nutrient-dense, microbe-rich soil and earth, that has been lost, which means that the ability of the soil to sequester carbon from the air and keep it in the ground where it belongs so that it doesn't cause issues with climate change, that power of the soil has been diminished because it's so degraded. There's some very scary news, and I've seen this research in a number of areas now, that we have about 60 more years left of farming if the degradation of the soil continues and if our food system continues as is. So we as practitioners, as individuals, as communities, need to be doing everything we can to support agricultural practices that are more regenerative, not just sustainable, but that are actually helping to not just sustain what we have, which is actually not very, very good, but we're trying to regenerate what we once had to bring back the health of our planet. And there are a number of major governmental organizations that are coming to the conclusion that while our food system is a big problem, it is also a potential solution. And that is where we continue to find hope, that if we can create more sustainable diets and adhere to more sustainable diets, this is going to help with mortality rates, to shrink that global food gap, to reduce the related greenhouse gas emissions, and to actually feed people and to feed more people. So there really is not an issue with having enough food in the world to feed people. It's about the distribution and it's about the quality of that food that really is the ultimate issue at hand. So when we think about addressing climate change, very often we think about cars and buses and planes and yes, and fossil fuels and fracking and coal, and those are absolutely critical. But it is so much more than that. If we want to address climate change, we have to absolutely have some kind of a change in our food system. So right now, 70% of the Amazon rainforest has actually been converted to use for agriculture, commercial agriculture, which again means that the carbon sequestering potential of the Amazon rainforest, the ability of those trees to take the carbon out of the air and sequester it in the trees themselves, in the soil, that potential has been diminished significantly. As I mentioned before, food waste is also a big, big problem. So about a third of the food that we produce is wasted or it's lost, meaning that if it's lost, it never makes it to market. It doesn't ripe properly or ripen properly. It doesn't look pretty enough so farmers can't actually sell it. And then we ourselves waste it. It rots in the refrigerator. Our restaurants throw it away because there's too much excess. And it winds up sitting in landfills and producing methane gas, which acts as a very, very negative greenhouse gas. Oops. But there's good news again, because guess what, everybody? We all eat every day, hopefully. And if we're lucky, we get to eat several times a day. So once again, we have this opportunity as individuals to make a difference, because consumer demand actually drives change. If you think about a menu item that was on a favorite restaurant that you had that suddenly disappeared from the menu, and you wondered why, and the person said, well, because no one ordered it. Well, that was consumer demand driving the change on that menu. So we again are able to make change by virtue of what we eat, don't eat, and how we treat our food and what we support. And again, I acknowledge that not everybody has the opportunity to make these kinds of decisions, to make these choices, but many of us do. And when we can, it's fantastic if we can actually put that into play. So one of the big issues is that animal foods are quite resource intensive, much more so than plant-based foods. So you can see over here on this chart from the World Resources Institute that when it comes to land use, freshwater consumption, and just overall greenhouse gas emissions, beef really tops the charts there in terms of being much, much more resource intensive. So actually the emissions per gram of protein for things like lamb and for beef are 250 times those of the legumes, which you can see over here in the pulse category. If you're not familiar with the word pulse, it also stands for legumes or lentils and beans, things like that. And right now, the research shows that about 20 servings of vegetables has fewer greenhouse gases than 1 serving of beef. So beef has a really, really high environmental footprint. It uses about 33% of our water. 25% of our land is pasture land for cattle. And this demand has been shown to be growing and growing and will continue to grow by about 95%. And now beef is becoming quite cheap, so a lot more people are eating it. Livestock in general is responsible for 15% of our greenhouse gases, which is the same amount that is generated by our transportation system. The same amount of carbon emissions that come from our transportation system is equivalent to our livestock production. And specifically meat and milk are 65% of that 15% of those greenhouse gases. So if we continue with our system as it is, there will be an 80% increase in global greenhouse gas emissions from our food. And we will continue to destroy our current habitat. So I want to mention something that's important. Actually, I'll come back to that in 1 second. Okay, so people are actually eating more protein than they need. So when we're thinking about the amount of protein that is recommended, and again, this is so individual. As integrative practitioners, we are so about personalizing and individualizing our recommendations. So for somebody to say, well, the average daily protein requirement is this much, that may not apply to every single person. But in general, especially in the wealthier countries, we are eating more protein than we actually need. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has called for eating less meat in general as a way to benefit our planet. And also we know that eating less meat for numerous individuals is also going to be healthier for the health of human in general. So when we are utilizing meat as a major food source, because of the deforestation, this is releasing about 50 billion tons of carbon into our atmosphere in the next 30 to 50 years. So the IPCC, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has recommended that plant-based diets, and this is not about going totally vegan, but this is a major opportunity for us to mitigate as well as to adapt to climate change. And we really need policy changes here to make sure that we're able to put forth recommendations to reduce meat consumption. Additionally, the Eat Lancet Commission, if you're not familiar with that, was a group of about 37 world leading scientists from numerous countries from all over. And they talked about creating a planetary health diet and an overall look at food, planet, and health to make sure that we had healthier dietary patterns, there was less food loss, less food waste, and overall there was an improvement in creating more sustainable food production practices. If you're not familiar with this report, it's absolutely fantastic to read. It's really helpful. And they call it the Great Food Transformation. I like to say that with a little extra, flair, because it just sounds more interesting. And what they surmise is that there needs to be a 50% reduction of red meat and sugar, and there needs to be a doubling of the consumption of fruits, nuts, vegetables, legumes, and nuts and seeds. And this is good news once again, because these are the very foods that we very often, as people working in whole health systems, are trying to promote that our patients eat more of anyway. So right now we are at about 216 pounds of meat per person per year, which is about a ½ pound of meat per day. Probably more than anyone needs, and that may also be contributing to some of the chronic health issues that we're seeing, depending on the quality of that meat, the source of that meat, and who's eating that meat, of course. So the estimate that the Eat Lancet Commission makes is that if we change our food production practices, this could reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 10% by 2050. if we make it that long. I don't mean to be disappointing here, but I am concerned. And if we increase our consumption of plant-based diets, this could also reduce our emissions by up to 80%. 80%. That is incredible. That is, it's one of those things like, if you found a pill that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions, someone would create it. This is just about changing our diet, or changing the diets and shifting the diets of our patients. Now, I feel some people getting nervous out there because it can be scary. Don't take away my bacon. I can hear some of you say, God darn it. And I get it. This is not about becoming vegan. And we need to make sure that we are not setting some kind of expectation or putting pressure on patients to be something that they can't be. And very often, this is simply not realistic, not only because it's not what someone wants to do, but it's not something that they can do. We do know that the more vegetarian and more plant-based people are, the more climate-friendly of a diet that is. We also know that this is not only about complete meat elimination, this is about less meat and better meat. Because ultimately, when farms are well managed with humane practices and have animal agriculture that is carried out in a way that is friendly to the planet, that is organic and, again, humane, this actually has benefits for our land and for the well-being of animals. So the manure from animals themselves is nourishment for our soil. And when we've got better soil, there's more water absorption capacity, there's more holding capacity. So if there is a flood, that soil is more able to take that on. When there's a healthy system, a healthy agricultural system that actually creates a habitat for other wildlife and pollinators. If you haven't seen the film, it's a great documentary. Oh my gosh, it just flew out of my head. I'll mention it at the end because I do have a slide on it as well, but it really shows how there's this wonderful system of animal agriculture. When it works, it actually helps to create the kind of farm that brings a healthy habitat and other animals into play. And ultimately, when there's a well-managed farm, it's more resilient to severe droughts, it's more resilient to flooding. So it really doesn't have to be about completely giving up meat. You can see here again from the World Resources Institute that even reducing animal protein consumption by half can help reduce greenhouse gases by 43%. So a great place to start is Meatless Mondays, if you're not familiar with that. This is just about reducing meat once a week or not having meat in the diet once a week. And this is a great platform for healthcare practitioners. It's actually a global platform. So I left this in the notes for you to see if you want to take a look at this, specifically for health practitioners and nutrition practitioners. So it is time to shine the spotlight on beans, lentils, peas, grains, nuts, and seeds, the very foods that very often promote so many other healthy pieces of our overall human health. So it really is about making sure that we are finding ways to make these foods seem more interesting and delicious and familiar. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to make that happen. This is a pyramid from the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition Foundation. And this is showing that the exact foods that we are trying to get people to eat more of, you can see in this lower half of the pyramid here. And again, we know the pyramid is a little antiquated, but this is a pyramid that is actually a flipped pyramid that shows the foods that we want to eat more of are actually lower on the environmental input, and the foods that we want to eat less of here from a health perspective are higher in terms of the environmental inputs and negative impact that they might have. So there's a nice crossover there when we begin to think about the health benefits for planet and for people. So when people transition more towards that plant-based diet, this can not only reduce global mortality by 6 to 10%, but also reduce our greenhouse gases by 29 to 70%. It's pretty wide margin there, but it depends on where, how much, and how often. So let's talk about recommendations and solutions. we've seen some of the problems. And again, I can't hope to cover the entirety of all of the issues that are happening in our current food system. But I just chose to focus on a few things that I thought would be practical for us to be able to discuss tonight and to come up with some solutions and ideas around. So as I mentioned, no one's got to go vegan. No one needs to be a completely different person. This is about small steps and starting somewhere and at least doing something. So when it comes to change, it is much bigger than just telling someone to do something. This is a fantastic graphic that I really appreciate, again, from the World Resources Institute, and it's about shifting diets for a sustainable future. And if you begin to look at what helps to shift a system, it is about so much more than just telling someone. It is about informing someone about the issue, but also we need to evolve the way that people perceive these types of foods. Eating in this way needs to become more socially desirable, or purchasing foods or practicing more eco-friendly practices needs to be desirable. And not doing those things needs to be socially unacceptable. So people will follow suit with the things that seem like they are more socially desirable, or will avoid doing the things that are less acceptable. We also need to shift the awareness. So we need to see things that are environmentally friendly in a way that is positive, that's memorable, exciting. Think of marketing. Think of the billboards that you pass by and how delicious that bacon cheeseburger looks. We need the same kind of marketing for a piece of broccoli or a lentil soup. Have you seen a billboard for lentil soup lately? I have not. We also, over here in the green, need to talk about selling the benefit. So make plant-based foods, make ecologically friendly based foods more affordable. Make sure that people understand why they're so compelling, what the benefit will be. And then lastly, when we have people make changes, that change needs to be easy. So when we think about people saying, don't take away my bacon, don't take away my coffee, don't take away my chocolate, I hear that very often as a dietitian. We need to make sure this is an easy transition. So it's not about necessarily taking those things away. It's about adding some things in. It's about combining. It's about making a shift. It's about doing what makes your body feel awesome. So the way that we can minimize that disruption is really key when it comes to change. And I'm sure many of you are already familiar with lots of behavior change techniques. So it's actually the position of the Society for Nutrition Education and Behavior that it is important for us to begin to include environmental sustainability in dietary guidance. This is not about a bunch of tree huggers anymore, or about people who, have some kind of environmental agenda. No, this is absolutely a critical part of our conversation with our patients. So while we know that choices around diet are really personal, lots of patients are actually motivated by their concern around the environment, and they would actually be excited to get more advice around ways that they can participate in dietary strategies and dietary guidelines and dietary choices that are actually going to benefit the planet, especially if they are from credentialed professionals. And this says nutrition professionals, but I really think this goes for a number of people working in this healthcare field in general. And our integrative practices that we incorporate into our conversation very often incorporate conversations around stress. So when we are working, whether it's acupuncture or, oh my gosh, I want to say any kind of body work that we're working with, this can be so helpful for stress levels, which can actually shift people's eating choices. When people are less stressed, we know they make different kinds of choices. And so many different practices and modalities that address stress offer our patients all kinds of new tools that can help with managing new eating habits, and all different kinds of lifestyle behaviors. So the very practices that we are putting into play can enable people to make the different kinds of choices in their life that will ultimately support the planet as well. Even if they aren't knowing that they're doing it directly, we as practitioners know that we can give people tools to manage stress and help them make different decisions. So you, as a practitioner, can incorporate climate change issues in your intake form. It's just part of the conversation. It's normalized now. So whether you want to ask things directly or whether you want to find your own style, I just threw up some questions up here, asking someone, how has climate change affected you? Or what connections do you see between what's going on for you medically and climate change? A lot of people who live near areas where they might be breathing in really poor quality air notice a difference between their asthma or their respiratory issues and the quality of the air. We are seeing air quality improve with the presence of this COVID crisis that's going on because there's fewer cars, there's fewer planes, and the air quality is actually improved. So people are seeing this direct connection. We can refer back to that, especially when this crisis is over and people's short-term memories are overrun with the next thing. And also being able to say to somebody, hey, let me know if you're interested at all in hearing about how some of the recommendations that we might be talking about can actually be beneficial for the environment. Who's to assume that they may not care? So having those conversations and having them be normal can be a great first step. And I am well aware of the fact that if someone is coming to you and they've got cancer or they've got an eating disorder or they're dealing with a mental health crisis, that the environment may not be at the top of the list. And that's just fine. We are working towards and looking for opportunities where we might be able to include this conversation. So you as a practitioner can obviously take charge of that conversation and decipher and assess when it's going to be appropriate for you to have it. So what does this healthy planetary diet look like? This is a plate from the Eat Lancet Commission that gives a sense of where we want to begin to see how much food is on the plate from different food categories. And I'll go through this a little bit in more depth. It's just so nice to have a graphic for people to be able to see. So I think this can be helpful for folks to actually take a look at. So the Eat Lancet Commission, as I mentioned, came up with this planetary health diet, and this is what it looks like. Now, this talks about whole grains and how many of these do you want, 232 grams a day of whole grains. Now, I'm a dietitian. I've been studying food for a long time. I don't even know what 232 grams of whole grains means. So I don't operate in this way as it relates to grams. If I were in a different country, perhaps in Europe, I might be thinking about food in grams. But as a United States citizen, I think about things in a different way of thinking. So so let's take a look and see what this actually looks like from just an easier perspective. So I did a little interpretation when we talked as it relates to what some of the food categories are. So the Eating for Planetary Health guidelines essentially focus on the fact that proteins should be from plants whenever possible. So fish and omega-3 sources should be about 3 times a week, about 6 ounces a week. Now, what's sustainable fish? Bigger conversation, so we're going to skip over that for right now. But having modest amounts of eggs and chicken, so only 6 ounces of chicken per week. And an ounce of chicken is about the size of the thumb, about 3 ounces, about the size of the palm, just to give you a read on that. Nuts should be about 1/3 to 1/2 of a cup a day. Beans or legumes or pulses or lentils, whatever you like to call them, I just call them beans, about at least 1/2 a cup a day. As it relates to carbohydrates, and of course there are some carbohydrates in beans as well, mostly whole grains is the recommendation, which is not too far off from where we are now. So about 1 cup of grains a day. And again, not everyone responds well to grains, so individualize your recommendations with your patients. And then making sure that less than 5% comes from added sugar. And this is a tough one because as a nation, we are very, very surrounded by foods that have added sugar in them. And it's often much, much more than we are meant to consume from both a health perspective and a planetary health perspective. Then having tubers or starchy vegetables, about 1/2 a cup to 1 cup a day. And in general, greater than 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. Dairy is considered to be moderate and optional. And as usual, we always need to take into consideration the individual. What do they have access to? What are they able to eat? What is their culture? What are they used to eating? And that is a key component of this Eat Lancet Commission planetary diet guideline. It's not just giving general guidelines, but to say these need to be adapted to the person, to the culture, to the area, to the demographic, from a global perspective, as it's appropriate for them. I'm going to pause and take a quick sip of my water. So I think people get nervous about protein because they think, oh my God, I can't have meat, or I can't have as much meat as I want. Well, how will I possibly get enough protein? So I wanted to just give a quick look at what some more plant-based proteins might look like. Half a cup of beans or lentils can be anywhere from 7 to 9 grams of protein. Half a cup of seeds or nuts, 10 grams of protein. About an ounce of meat or fish is 7 grams of protein. 3 ounces of tofu, 10 grams of protein. So if we're looking to get to about 55 to 65 grams of protein, which is a fairly typical recommendation for someone who might be around 150 pounds. This is, again, we're going to individualize this to pertain to the person in front of us. But this is just a quick look at what a breakfast, lunch, and dinner might look like. So breakfast could be a cup of oatmeal with some nuts. Lunch could be a cup of lentil soup. And I'm just focusing on the protein piece here. Snack might be a cup of hummus with some vegetables. And then dinner might be about 3 ounces of fish. So I tried to be fairly inclusive here in terms of helping people to feel comfortable with various different sources of protein and to have some variety as well. And then there's this need for us to increase our fresh produce consumption and to reduce processed foods. So when we're thinking about climate change, again, we have a large amount of monocultures that have had a really big impact on our climate. This is soy, wheat, corn, and these are all the foods that go straight into the processed foods that we're eating that are cheap and available. And this is, again, a whole other issue when it comes to the food system. But we're trying to reduce the processed foods in people's diets. So getting people to replace chips with nuts and seeds, or replacing their sweet processed foods with fruits, adding vegetables wherever possible to soups and other dishes. Again, if we can get more people eating whole foods, this will help drive consumer demand, and that will ultimately help drive systemic change. I would like to make a note here, because I find this quite fascinating. We do not actually produce enough fruits and vegetables in this country, that would be the USA, to meet the guidelines that are put out by the USDA. So this is quite interesting, right? So they're making recommendations that they can't ultimately fulfill. And right now we know that agribusinesses are profiting from the monocultures. So the soy, wheat, and corn industries are making a huge amount of money because all of those foods are becoming cheaper and cheaper as they are subsidized by the government and going into processed foods, which are ultimately causing a lot of the chronic health issues, or I shouldn't say causing, I should say contributing to, because there's no one cause, but contributing to some of the health issues that we're working with right now. So then there's the how of change, because we can say, eat more lentils, eat less sugar, have a banana, have some broccoli. But why is it hard? Well, a lot of people have a very interesting relationship with food. It's emotional, it's personal, it can be comforting. And then food choices are not only driven by emotions and relationship with food, but they're driven by stress and a busy lifestyle and convenience and food access. What people have access to drives what they're eating. Finances. A lot of the times, healthier food is becoming more expensive than less healthy food, and that drives people's consumer choices. What's in their environment? What kind of environment are they in that might have an influence on their food choices? Lack of education, not even knowing that something might be good or bad for them. And then, of course, their culture. Where do they lie with their culture in terms of what is meaningful for them or important in their culture? So as practitioners, one piece of advice that I like to share is to really explore that relationship with food, the same way that we might explore that person's relationship to their body or to nature or to their sense of health. So asking those direct questions of your patients: what is your relationship to food? What does food mean to you? What role did it play in your childhood, in your history? What do you crave and when do you crave it? And I appreciate the question where we're asking them, how do you feel about your intake of cake? Or how do you feel about your intake of alcohol? Or how do you feel about your intake of meat? Because very often we'll be met with the answer, well, I should probably eat less. And then they have come up with that assessment, and it's a lot easier to work from the assessment that the patient has made as opposed to our assessment of, hey, you're eating too much cake, too much alcohol. So putting it into their court is really, really helpful. And we know that as integrative practitioners because we put the patient at the center of the conversation. So some possible solutions are actually talking with and talking through that person's relationship with food and exploring when they have what we think of as negative self-talk about the food or about the things that they are doing as it relates to food, and helping them to make those conversations more neutral. So instead of having someone say, I'm a jerk for eating pizza, create neutrality around that, and say, okay, there was a stressful situation that made me crave pizza and I chose to eat that tonight. And really making sure that they are aware of their patterns. Nothing can change if people aren't actually aware of why they are choosing those foods to begin with. So very often people will be driven to eating because of an emotion or stress or frustration. Right now, even during COVID, we know that a lot of people are really struggling with their relationship with food because food is such a comfort during this time of uncertainty. Additionally, if we can explore with them that they aren't skipping meals or that their meals aren't completely lacking in balance, which can increase those cravings for those sugary foods that we're trying to get people to eat less of. So making sure they have a balanced plate of fats and carbs and protein so that they have fewer cravings. Additionally, we as practitioners love finding out in the integrative field what matters to people. So behavior change is so much easier to help someone with when we truly understand, and when they truly understand what's important to them. What do they care about? Why would they even want to change their diet or improve their health or help the planet? Does being in nature, is that something for them that they value? Do they have children or grandchildren, or are they thinking about future generations that they want to make sure they are leaving a safer planet for, or that they want to be around to see graduate? So hearing people's story can be a big help in terms of helping people to make changes. Additionally, I love this quote, which is, when a person feels accepted for who they are and what they do, it allows them the freedom to consider change rather than to defend against it. So when we listen and when we encourage people to make these explorations without any judgment, it ultimately helps them make choices that are better for them and ultimately better for the planet. So the recommendations that we might give to support health in general are going to support the planet. So this may not be even about having a conversation around planetary health, because it might not be appropriate, but you as a practitioner may be making suggestions to them that are beneficial to their health. And you internally know that these are also suggestions that are going to be less detrimental to our planet, to our environment. So that can be your own internal motivator as you work with a patient as well. And then exploring with them around making these changes. It's important to explore, what are their food preferences? What flavors do they love? What vegetables do they actually like? I'm not going to get anyone to eat zucchini if they don't like zucchini, right? What's someone's favorite bean? What's their favorite fruit? And if they do have something that they drink a lot of, maybe it's alcohol, or maybe it's soda, or maybe they do eat a lot of meat and they're trying to reduce that consumption, we can say, what is it that you love about soda or about meat? And very often we can find a replacement for the thing that they love about it, whether it's the crunch or the smell, maybe it's the flavor. We can help them transition to different ideas around that. So Benjamin Franklin said, tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. So when we involve and include the patient in their own decision-making, that helps with change. So actually saying to them, how would you feel about, and then putting the recommendation there, eating plant-based foods once a week, reducing your meat consumption by 1 meal a week. What might you be ready to shift? What's the biggest barrier? What do you think you could do? What would make it easier for you to make that happen? And what do you think the benefit would be? So for instance, I had a conversation with a patient about a year ago where I was asking him about vegetables. He wasn't getting enough vegetables in. And so I said, well, how would you feel about getting in an extra serving of vegetables every day? He said, well, I don't know, maybe. I said, well, what would you be ready to shift? He said, I could probably get in one every other day. I said, okay, well, what's the biggest barrier to making that happen? He said, I just don't have the time to chop the vegetables. I said, well, what do you think you could do? He said, well, I could probably chop the vegetables while I was watching TV. I said, well, what would make it easy for you to make that happen? Well, what I could do is, I could tell my wife to watch the kids so that I could actually chop the vegetables while I'm watching the news. And I said, well, what do you think the benefit would be? Well, I'd probably have more energy. And then, so that was a conversation. He came up with his own recommendation ultimately. And then it was easier for him to put it into place as opposed to my saying, chop vegetables while you're watching TV twice a week, good to go. Thanks, give me $50. So asking them to really include their own thoughts about how they could make these changes, I think is a key component to help people make those shifts. And we also know that beans, or pulses, are quite beneficial. So they have been shown in numerous research to improve glycemic profile, to help with high blood pressure, help with maintaining a healthy body weight. They're associated with lower issues with cardiovascular disease, antioxidant benefits, less inflammation. So for those who need additional ideas or research around why they should be eating more pulses and beans, these can be some great areas to show them. And people need ideas around how to become more plant-based. A lot of people right now have been saddled with, okay, I've been told they need to stock up on bulk foods during coronavirus time, for instance, and what the heck do I do with this big thing of lentils that I bought or this big thing of chickpeas? I don't know what to do. So we need to give them ideas, making chili, making a bean burger, trying a lentil soup, a black bean soup, having a hummus, and a bean dip, adding beans to salads, things that they're already eating, and combining with a meaty flavor. That's one thing I love about chili, is it's a great place to off-ramp from the meat world and on-ramp into the plant-based world by combining the flavor of meat in a smaller amount in a hearty chili dish. And if you are someone who's in private practice, or you have an office, or you have a space where people come to, it is a critical thing to have recipes. So we can't just say, make a hummus. We have to give them a recipe. We have to show them what canned beans look like and how to get them into their lives. We have to have maybe a cookbook out there for them to see. And then nuts and seeds are another food that we're trying to get people to eat more of. We need to get people out of that almond rut. So if we're trying to get people to have more plant-based foods in their diet, nuts and seeds are a great thing to throw on top of cereals or add to grains or throw into a little salad or bake into some muffins or make a dressing that's out of tahini, which is sesame seed butter. Making a nut milk. If someone doesn't want to buy a really expensive $3.50 nut milk, just take a quarter cup of nuts and blend that with 8 ounces of water, and you've got a nut milk. Add to a smoothie or smear some nut butter on a banana or an apple, which is a great dessert. And once again, if we're looking for health benefits, we know that nuts being consumed every single day have improved lipid profiles, support healthy weight, and also have lots of anti-inflammatory benefits as well. And hemp seeds, I always like to highlight, are one of the most high yielding and sustainable foods out there. Low inputs are needed, so not a lot of pesticides, not a lot of chemical fertilizers, and a really positive impact on the environment. And in general, when we're looking at things like nuts and seeds and lentils, these are foods that actually are beneficial to issues with climate. So lentils, for instance, actually take nitrogen out of the air and bring them into the soil. So that's utilized as a way of fertilizing the soil and the plant. So these are also crops that can be used as cover crops, which can be beneficial for keeping the land more resilient as well. So it really is about easing into transitions. As I say, no need to go whole hog or whole chickpea. It's about adding the food. So if someone's loving bacon, they make bacon with the greens. If they love their meatloaf or their burger, they make half of it with vegetables or mushroom. If they have a sandwich, then they have a sandwich with more vegetables. If they love eggs, then you add the vegetables in there, adding beans to soups, and really making sure that they are combining the foods with things that they enjoy. I had a patient who loved the flavor of meat. And when I got her on smoked paprika, that was a game changer for her because it really tasted like what she remembered meat should taste like for her, or chipotle, things like that. And if someone loves curry, for instance, making sure that they are getting that curry flavor, but they just replace the meat or the chicken with the tofu instead, if they can do tofu. Additionally, other ways that we as practitioners can make sure that these concepts are more familiar is just to have them out in our offices so people can see them. They see pictures of beans. When we see things over and over again, they become less foreign to us and we're more apt to use them. We can also show where some of these foods come from. You can actually look on the back of some of these containers that you have and see how far did this food actually travel. That transportation system part of this food system is also a component. It's not as big as working on converting to more plant-based diets, but it is something to consider when we think of getting an apple from New Zealand instead of getting an apple from Washington State, which is right in our backyard for me in Seattle. That's something we can shift for sure. And also having resources and visual aids so that people begin to see on the wall or on the waiting room table or in your office somewhere or something on your website, depending on where you practice, how you practice. The more they can see information about the benefits of eating in this way, of supporting a healthier food system, the more familiar, the more easy it is for them to remember these things on a regular basis. Positive associations as well. So they see things like, what are seasonal fruits and vegetables? So again, this isn't just about being plant-based. This is also about how do we promote the farmers and the farmers markets and getting vegetables into people's diets in a way that is supportive to our environment and is naturally in alignment with our ecosystem. So showing people what's in season, so they're focused on those kinds of foods. Again, consumer demand will drive that change. And the carbon footprint of certain menu items. You can see that a beef hot dog has a much, much higher carbon footprint than a tofu veggie stir fry. So when that person goes to a fast food restaurant, there's a possibility that they may make a different choice. Think about the Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat that is now driving consumer change, and choices are different at these places. I'm not saying that the Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat is the solution, nor is it really addressing the true problem of our food system crisis, but it is a prime example of how offering these kinds of foods and the fact that consumers are demanding this has enabled these organizations to put them on their menus. And then to encourage farmers markets and recycling as well, showing these images of people at a farmer's market or having your business name on a grocery bag that's more friendly to the environment, or having a picture of how do we recycle foods, because we know that we're throwing away so many containers that could be recycled, or we are wasting food that could be composted. There are, as I mentioned, so many foods that get thrown away. So we can reduce our food waste of our clients and patients by educating them around including some of these funny looking produce pieces from either misfit produce or imperfect produce, or just going to a farmer's market. Whenever I go to a farmer's market, I say, give me your ugliest, broccoli, or give me your craziest looking carrot. I'll take it, because no one else may buy it if I don't. Additionally, that best before that we often see on all kinds of labels of foods really means nothing. It is essentially the date by which a food company estimates that a food will actually taste its best, not that it will rot and suddenly, poison you to death. So we need to make sure our patients know that they don't need to throw away this food. It's just an estimate by the food company. And we need to support organic and regenerative agricultural farming when it is possible, if it is possible. I once again acknowledge that there are many marginalized communities that in no way have an opportunity to make these kinds of choices. But when we are able to change the system in general, and hopefully we as a community and as a profession will be working towards these bigger changes. But when people are able to make these choices, it's really key. It's healthier for humans, the soil microbial population of organizations and farming or small scale farmers that utilize regenerative practices are just healthier in general. They need fewer pesticides. There's less energy that is needed. There's less pollution that is generated, less water. There's more carbon that gets stored in the land. The biodiversity is much, much greater. And as a result, much, much more resilient to climate change. And lastly, if we can encourage cooking or meal prep, no one has to be a Martha Stewart in the kitchen. Sometimes it's just about opening a can, throwing it into a bowl, opening a jar of this, throwing that into a bowl, putting a little sauce on that, and bam, you got dinner. So cooking is one of the most amazing things that we can help our patients with. It's better for the health of our human population. It is better for the environment. It can help with the relationship that people have with food, with the connection that they have to food. And even just buying an herb plant, you know, having a thing of parsley on someone's windowsill can actually be a wonderful connector to the earth. It also connects us to our community. When we cook with others, when we cook for others, it connects us to our culture, to our traditions, getting our patients to cook the foods that their ancestors cooked, that their family cooked, you know, the generation before them, really as an amazing healing technique is getting people connected to their culture through food. It's also a way for people to slow down, to be mindful, which we're always trying to work on as practitioners in the integrative field. And it can save money, and ultimately it reduces waste. So how can we get our patients to really and truly enjoy it? As I mentioned, healthcare contributes to 9% of our greenhouse gases. So I wanted to give you a few resources. Healthcare Without Harm is an amazing organization that is paving the way with much more environmentally aware and sustainable both buildings, practices within the hospitals, supporting local and sustainable agriculture in terms of the food that they are serving. Great organization to know about. These are some resources for healthcare workers, for culinary professionals, and a handout actually from the Healthcare Without Harm from Canada on climate change for patients. So great thing to look at. And what can you do professionally? Besides everything we've talked about, you can speak up. I feel like our voices are stronger than ever, and we have an incredible opportunity. If you work at a university, if you go to a university, if you sub at a university, we can promote these concepts in the classroom when we're teaching, but also from an institutional level. It can be that Meatless Monday. It can be about recycling, composting, having more plant-based foods in the cafeteria. If you have a social media platform, you can promote plant-based foods. You can promote organic, promote sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, talk about the soil, talk about the connection between climate change and our food system. Keeping the messages positive is always key. I have found that that really works well when we are upbeat, when we are uplifting, when we are not blaming or being incredibly negative. People respond. It's pretty exciting. If there's a conference that you are going to or that you are managing or you are organizing, having there be vegetarian options is fantastic. Making sure you reach out to your people who are attending so that they know exactly, or you know exactly what they would like to eat, so there's less waste. Encouraging people to bring their own cups and mugs and silverware and napkins, so there's less plastic water bottles and less usage of plastic plates and paper. So once we begin to do this more often, this is just normal. Everyone's got a bamboo fork in their bag and they bring it out. Everyone's got their own mug and they bring it out. So plastic water bottles just become a thing of the past. And what can you do personally? Buy local, buy organic when you can. Add in more plant-based foods. Bring your container. If you ever go to a coffee shop again, if we're ever allowed out of our houses to go to a coffee shop, and I guess you can still go to coffee shops in lots of places, but bring your own mug when we are able to do that again. I think we aren't right now because of the specifications around the COVID virus. But if you go out to a restaurant, see if you can get them to get more plant-based foods on the menu. Every time I go out to a restaurant, I say, do you have any lentils? Do you have any black beans? Do you have any chickpeas? And why not? And I would come back here more often if you did. So again, consumer demand drives that change. Talk to your friends, talk to your community, contact your local and state representatives about these issues. Keep an eye on the Farm Bill. And these are some questions to ask yourself. What are you already doing that you're really proud of and you feel like is a great decision? And I'm going to give you kudos. Bravo for doing something. Awesome. No, nothing is too small. What have you thought about doing that you aren't doing, but you could do? And how could you see yourself as an agent for change in your personal life and your professional life? And I always like to end my presentations with making sure that people are committed to doing one thing this week. One thing. I don't care what that is. It can be having a conversation. It can be buying a can of chickpeas. It can be promoting a local farmer who you know sells grass-fed beef. Whatever it is, something that you could see yourself putting into play. These are additional resources, services. There's that documentary, The Need to Grow. Fantastic documentary. Plant-based recipe sites. These are, if you're interested in more education, these are some great places to go. Believe me, I have about 50 more links that I could share with you, but I had to keep it down to just a few here. These are some places where you can join in the conversation, whether it's the Meatless Mondays global platform. This is a wonderful Facebook group called the Planetary Health Alliance that I'm a part of, a wonderful group of people really working towards change. And then these are some great reads, both for you and also even for a patient if they're interested. At Bastyr, where I work, we have formed a health and climate crisis committee with the mission of making sure that at some point we are creating resources and tools and perhaps a certificate at some point to help practitioners in the integrative field work with climate health effects on human health. So keep an eye out for that. And I think I will end there and ask for any questions. Thank you so much for being here, for sticking around. I think I went a few minutes over my hour. So thank you so much. It was my pleasure. And now I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Mary, for this lovely, informative, and timely presentation. A lot to digest here.
Yes.
No pun there. And I'm really excited about making a pot of lentil soup. Beautiful
Ooh.
slides. Yeah. So now we will move into our question and answer session. So please write any questions you have for Mary in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will get started with that.
And I'm not seeing any Q's and A's in my, when I click on Q&A, it just says no open questions. So I'm not seeing any questions right now. Maybe no one's put any in there.
Mary, that is what I am seeing as well.
Okay.
So perhaps your presentation was so thorough that there are no questions.
I doubt that. There's about 100 different pieces that I could continue to talk about at some point, but I see there was a lot in the chat, but I'm not necessarily seeing any questions. So I hope.
I see one question in the chat, Mary. Will the slides be shared later?
Yes, I would be happy to share the slides. So I can send them to you and you can send out a PDF of them as if you want, if that works for you.
Okay, great. Oh, I see Rashida has a question about, are there any resources for children specifically?
Wow, that's a big question. Is this resources for children for what? For food or for something around climate change? I mean, we know that children are more susceptible to issues with climate change. For food choices. Gosh, I didn't have any specific recipes or resources for children, but one thing that I love as a great cookbook is called Feeding the Family, Feeding the Whole Family by Cynthia Lair. And also a great book called, great recipe book called Nourishing Meals. That's my favorite recipe book. And it's written by two people who have 5 kids or 4 kids. And they talk all the time about all the things that they're making that are well loved by their children. So. All right. Did we cover?
So are there any other questions?
And I would say that if people have questions in the future, my email is on that presentation. It's mary@marypurdy.co. So if you have questions, or if there was something you thought, gosh, you should add this to your presentation, believe me, I'm very open to feedback. And I would like to create a presentation over and over again that continues to build on itself. So if there are other resources that you think I missed, or something that you think would be really beneficial for other practitioners to know, absolutely let me know. I'm very, very open to hearing it.
Hey, Mary, I see that Michaela has a question. I think Michaela is going to write it in the Q&A.
Okay, and I see you said, okay, so I'm going to write a note back to Rashida.
Okay.
So I see, are there any resources or experiences that you would recommend for dietetic students? Oh, Alex, yes. I am so glad. That is not going to be something that I have on the top of my head, or off the top of my head, or in the top of my head, whatever the right preposition is. But yes, and in fact, I don't know if you are connected to the Academy, but the Academy actually has a great, a bunch of resources that just came out in recently around food system stuff. But there's a wonderful course through Johns Hopkins. It's on Coursera and it's free. And it is called Sustainable Food Systems, or Intro to Food Systems. It's fantastic. That I would say absolutely have them take that. They can actually get a certificate in it. And then lastly, if you're not familiar with hunger and environmental nutrition, they put out a certificate of training program through the Academy that's called Sustainable Food Systems. There's 4 modules, and again, you can get a certificate in that. And the first module I actually took recently, and it was absolutely fantastic. So I highly, highly recommend that. It's $24. It might be less for students, but Alex, if you reach out to me, I'd be more than happy to share some of the other resources that I have as well, because I would love to get more dietetic students into this. We need more people, more dietitians who are interested in this getting involved, because I think we're in a prime position to do so. And I see Deforia has written, she's off to the store for lentils. So fabulous. Hope you're wearing a mask.
And there's a question about why not promote yogurt and some dairy for protein also?
Yes, that can be another source for protein. That was just something that since I was working with more of a plant-based meal, but yogurt and dairy, again, it depends on someone's culture, someone's digestive capacity, how they feel about the dairy industry. Obviously, not all dairy is created equal, the same way that not all food is created equal. But absolutely, for the appropriate person, yogurt and dairy, and I would always recommend organic as well for numerous reasons, when possible, if possible, as an option.
And there's another question that just came out about the toll on the environment when it comes to getting produce from other states, countries that we couldn't necessarily get in our own state. For instance,
Yes.
here in Washington State, it's hard to get avocados, a tropical fruit.
And I guess I should read these questions. I was curious, how do you justify the toll on the environment when it comes to getting produce from other states and countries? How would I justify it? I wouldn't. I would say the more we can get local produce that is closer to home, that's grown closer to home, the better. So avocados are really not a very sustainable food. That much to the chagrin of many of us who love our avocado toast, avocados are really not a highly sustainable food unless you're living in a place where avocados are grown. So I think we should look for substitutes when possible to reduce the impact on the climate. So what is native to your area? And very often, if it's native to your area, you will be getting the benefits of the fact that it's when foods are seasonal, when they're grown in the habitat that they are meant to be grown in, they are more nutritious. So, but again, some of us aren't always willing, or some of our patients may not always be willing to give up oranges. There's no oranges grown in Washington, but I gotta have an orange every once in a while. So I get oranges from California. Okay.
Thank you, Mary.
I hope that makes sense.
Okay. Any other questions? Last call for questions. I know we're all so hungry now after seeing all those beautiful slides. I know I am. So let me just look one more time.
And
Oh, here we go. Do you see the new question, Mary? Do you have resources on how dietitians can work?
Yes, I do. Again, Taylor, this is not a specialty of mine because I don't work in food service, but if you reach out to me, I will give you the resources that I do have. And again, there is a wonderful resource on the Meatless Mondays global platform. There's a group in that Meatless Mondays global platform that specifically is for people who are in food service. And they have, and I can write this, I don't think I can write it down on here, but they have a wonderful resource on how to make food systems or food service systems more sustainable. So
Put it in the chat, Mary.
I can't access it because
Oh,
I
you
can't.
can't.
I have to get rid of. I have to go off the screen to my email.
Yeah. Hey, you know, I just wanted to add, here on Vashon Island, where I live near Seattle, we have a Bastyr nutrition grad working in the elementary school, and she oversees the school meals, the food service there. Well, when school was happening. So I always found that just very inspiring that the kids here could have access to that nutritional
Yes.
knowledge. And
yeah, and you know, I actually just I was just on a conference call with somebody, and she told me about an organization. It's called something like Lean to Green Kids. And she just said, hey, I want to put this on your radar screen. We're all about getting, it's like, you know, produce to kids in schools. I just can't remember the name of it, but there are numerous organizations that are working towards more eco-friendly choices for children in school. So please reach out to me. I think it was Taylor, and I'll get you some of those.
great.
Okay.
So I just want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening. And special thanks to our guest speaker, Mary Purdy. Just so lovely to have you with us. We so appreciate you doing this presentation. And also want to thank Jessica Price, our AIHM Academic Success Coordinator, who has been behind the scenes providing us with tech support. So appreciate you, Jess. And I also want to thank our colleagues at Bastyr University for collaborating with us to make this happen. AIHM has launched over 100 chapters and student alliances globally. If you would like to be involved, check out the AIHM website. If you're interested in our conference, fellowship program, you can find all that information at AIHM.org. If you're interested in membership or our chapters or student alliances, you can reach me directly at hcarey@aihm.org. We thank you again for your time and attention, and may you all stay safe and healthy.
Thank you, Heather. Good night.
Good night.